Hi everyone, this is Terence Cheong. I'm the Consulting Engineer Manager for BitSight, covering Asia Pacific, including Japan. And thank you for joining us for this session, where we'll be looking at presenting Japanese BitSight cybersecurity risk rating, which essentially is based on publicly available data points. And throughout this presentation, we will be looking at benchmarking Japan's cybersecurity risk posture as of November 2021 versus pre-pandemic, which will take reference from January of 2020, and also be comparing Japan's cybersecurity risk posture against the other G7 countries, Asia, ASEAN, and also the greater world averages. So let us begin. Now, as of November, Japan's BitSight cybersecurity risk rating as a country is 630. Now let's see how well Japan is performing when compared against the rest of your peers. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the BitSight security rating, the BitSight rating is run between 250 to 900. Right? The higher the rating, the better the cybersecurity risk rating of the country or company is. So here we can see the 7 G7 countries pre-pandemic, taking reference again from January of 2020. That is versus today's rating of November 2021. The black lines here are referencing January of 2020. So you can see 3 countries have actually experienced slight rating drops, namely Japan, the United States, as well as Canada. Right. So Germany has actually maintained the same. And the same can be said for the United Kingdom as well. And 2 countries have actually improved. We have France, who's improved, as well as Italy. So those 2 countries are doing pretty well. And as it stands right now, Germany is the best performing in terms of cybersecurity. And of course, Japan is not too far behind. Let's take a look at how Japan is performing versus the whole of Asia. Here you can see Japan is practically first, with the only country ahead of Japan being North Korea. As we all could understand, it's because of their internet security strategies. Now, this slide will be a good opportunity for you to observe which countries your organizations or your respective companies actually have business footprints in. Since Japan is a leader in Asia, and I would have no doubt many of your businesses would have footprints in the rest of Asia, and your businesses would be exposed in some way, shape, or form to the inherent cybersecurity risks present in these countries. Well, for a start, you can see the average line here, right? And this would be rating of 540. You can see only 23 countries are performing better, whilst 20 countries are actually not doing as well. Considering Japan has many manufacturing factories outside of Japan, right, this would be a good time to take note of the posture of those countries and the potential risks that they pose. Let's take a look next at ASEAN. And ASEAN is of course closely related to Japan by nature of geography, of course, and of course a lot of business dealings as well. For example, I can understand there's a lot of Japanese car factories in Thailand as well as Malaysia, and clothing factories in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Being close business partners between Singapore and Japan, you can see Singapore is doing pretty well, as is Malaysia. Now, for the rest of the countries, for example, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, as well as Laos, they are slightly behind. So it would be prudent to take note of your security strategies when approaching these countries. Definitely not in terms of just technologies, but you should also pay attention to the people as well as the processes. Next, let's take a look at the industry overview for Japan. And if you've attended this same presentation last year, the presentation format is the same. And again, we are looking at a representation of pre-pandemic, which is January of 2020, versus today, as of November 2021. Now we have 22 industries. And of the 22 industries, you can see there are only 3 industries that have maintained the same, right? So we've got the aerospace industry, we have finance industries who've maintained the same, and also government politics, which is relatively same, if not exactly the same. Now, only 5 industries have improved. That be the legal space, which I believe last year wasn't doing as well. We have the insurance space that improved, real estate as well. Education has also improved very well. And also lastly, but of course not least, transportation has improved slightly also. Unfortunately, the rest of the 14 industries have actually decreased. The most significant being healthcare, right? So you can see for retail, which is here, a big drop. Healthcare, which I just mentioned, is right here. Energy and resources, you may have noticed, is a fairly significant big drop here. Now, in this case, it really is because of an outlier. We've come to realize that there is a power company in Japan that owns a service provider, right? Similar to Google, AWS, and by nature of the business that they are providing, they're going to inherit a lot of bad traffic and bad findings, which are not a fair reflection of those companies. So we are looking at ways to better reflect that, especially for the energy resources space. So this is where you're standing. Just keep an eye out for your own respective industry averages. Next, we will look at the industries versus world averages. Now, in this case, the black line is a representation of the industry average, right, for the rest of the world. And one of the biggest outlier in this case is telecommunications. You see the line right here at the bottom. That's because of the scale that we are presenting this at, with the minimum being at about 400, and most telecommunication countries would perform way below 400. That makes them here. So for better representation, we are representing them here with a dotted line. Now, by and large, you will observe that of the 22 industries, 16 of the industries for Japan is actually performing much better than your world average industries. The industry world averages. So that is doing really well. Now, some of the outliers you see that aren't performing as well are utilities, which is fairly significant. Energy resources, which I explained previously, there is an outlier organization here. Of course, transportation still has some gap despite the slight improvement in this period, and also still healthcare and wellness. Right. So this is very important. If you are in the healthcare and wellness space, after observing what's been going on for the rest of the healthcare in the pandemic period, it would be good look towards improving the cybersecurity risk postures. So this is the performance of the industries across time as well as versus your industry averages. Right. Of course, this is also indicative of your own performance in your own space, right? So just take note of the benchmarking ratings. Next, we will look at the Japanese IP address space, and this provides insights into how well Japan is doing as a country. So first up, we will look at Japan's performance against the other G7 countries, right, as well as Asia. So Japan is represented by this thick orange line, and you can see here Japan has been performing consistently well. Asia being the dotted line right up here. So they have reduced the number of infections fairly significantly. Just let me orientate you to this slide. If essentially what you are seeing here is the number of infections per 100 internet users. So really, you want to be low. What that means is if you're looking at a 5, it means for every 100 internet users, you have 5 botnet infections. And at this level, you're looking at every 100 internet users, you have 10 botnet infections. So really, you want to be low here. So Japan is doing really well. Of the G7 countries, you can see actually China has achieved significant drops, a 59% drop. France as well as UK have fairly significant drops as well, right? 57% for France and 55% for the UK. The only country that runs contrary to this trend is actually the United States, who've had a slight increase of 1%. So that's fairly unusual, but it is nonetheless a good trend to be aware of. And moving on from botnet comparisons, let's take a look at how well the countries are doing with regards to some of BitSight's risk ratings. So the first risk rating we'll look at is the categories under compromised systems, which in the BitSight's context provides you with insights into the gaps in terms of cybersecurity postures of a country or company. Of course, these are indicated by actual infections like botnet infections being one of them. The other risk vector will be file sharing, and the file sharing would actually give you indications of the cybersecurity mindedness of the population or of the employees. For these two categories, the data that we are observing today is largely driven by BitSight's proprietary technology. And what we will be looking at is, of course, Japan, which is the orange colored line, versus Asia, which is the green line, and G7 countries, which is represented by the blue line. Now, what is interesting to be aware of is that across botnet infections, across malware servers, you will actually see very similar trend lines. And this indicates that the risks from these vectors are not specifically geographically isolated, which means there's an increase in the number of, the increase in the ratings for these behaviors or these risk vectors. That increase can be seen across the different geographies, right? Japan, Asia, as well as G7. Just to quickly orientate everyone here, this graph is actually a representation of the BitSight rating. As you can see, for this one is 520 to 770, which essentially means the higher you are, the better the cybersecurity posture actually is. And these two trends, it's pretty significant. So you can be aware that the infection trends are not limited by geography, and thus infection trend affecting, for example, the G7 countries, where there's an increase and a reduction you can see here is likely going to be similar to what's happening in Asia as well as Japan. Interestingly, as much as botnet infections and malware servers are compromised systems risk vectors, this trend is not mirrored in the potentially exploited risk vectors nor the file sharing risk vectors. To some extent, you can see actually Japan is quite the outlier, right? Where you actually had a significant increase in terms of risk with regards to potential exploits, whereas for Asia as well as for the G7 countries, they've maintained pretty similarly and maintaining their postures. And then you can see there is a slight increase here for file sharing for G7, and Japan is doing really well as well. So in the beginning of the pandemic right here, right, where we are looking at perhaps the first quarter of 2020, you'll see an improvement similarly for Japan and G7 that maintain the same. And Asia has kind of stayed on its own. right? They've continued and not really had much improvements. So this is quite an interesting observation, especially when Japan has businesses in Asia. This would be something you might want to take note of. The other that is a far outlier in this case is actually spam propagation. It would seem that there was a significant increase. You can see from the Japan trend line, followed by some ups and downs in the middle, and then there was a steep drop-off, which indicates that there were significant spam propagation in Japan, or actually out of the Japan IP space. And that has some sense recovered, but again, it's on the downtrend. But this increase and downtrend is observable for the rest of the world also. So it seems that the trend is catching back up again with regards to the spam propagation. And of course, last but not least, for unsolicited communications, you can see the trend lines are pretty much the same, similar to botnet infections and malware servers. So based on these three risk factors, you can see that there are similarities and trends and campaigns that could be running in the different geographies, right? Asia versus Japan versus G7. And for some of these other risk factors, Japan is a far outlier. So this is the observation for the compromised systems risk factors. Moving on, we will look at these diligence risk vectors, some of them, because there is quite a number. There's diligence risk vectors are a representative of the cybersecurity hygiene. So as mentioned, there are 14 diligence risk vectors, but we'll focus on 6, which is presented here. And here the observations are fairly varied, as not as close as we had previously monitored for the compromised systems. And we can look at TLS certs and open ports. You can see by and large, the Japan and G7 countries are fairly close with regards to these two risk vectors. Now, the hypothesis is that, because of the stricter and similar compliance regulatory mandates or requirements, this ties the performance for SSL certs and open ports for Japan and the G7 countries. Risk vectors that shows maybe a slight difference in terms of requirements is actually the SSL configurations risk vector, which goes into the actual configuration, i.e. the required encryption methodologies and so on, that G7 countries are doing slightly better, right, than Japan, right? Japan has a bit of waver towards the end, right? And you can see that difference in terms of the trajectory. Even Asia has seen a significant increase just in the last half a year or so. And so this is a fairly interesting observation. And off the back of Asia, you can see for web application headers as well as server software, interestingly enough, Asia is doing very well when compared to Japan as well as the G7 countries, which is interesting. Again, you can see that G7 and Japan is similar in trend. Now, one of the hypotheses, of course, is because of the websites and the web traffic requirements for the different regions, and it is unusual to see this very steep drop for Japan performance, and then you can see and then a steep increase, and then still a gradual down reduction in terms of the ratings. It's hard to point on, but it is an observation that we have. The other unusual observation is here. You can see good for Japan because Japan is doing pretty well right here, right? Fairly consistently high in terms of insecure systems. And insecure systems is BitSight's risk vectors that provides insights into IoT devices, such as if you have outdated TV that's sitting in your lobby that's reaching out and attempting to download updates. This is one of BitSight's way of capturing such behaviors. And you can see inversely that G7 as well as Asia has very similar trend lines. So this is another very interesting observation to see this. right? So these are the risk vectors that provide insights into the performance. We've gone through 12 of them. And next, let's take a look at the performance of the Japanese companies. And the Japanese companies are quite very interesting as well for those who've followed us for the last year. And this is the way we'll be presenting it. Of course, here you are looking at the Japanese top 100 organizations. And in the next 4 slides, you will see us present the performance of the top 100 companies you're looking at here. And then we'll be showing you all of the Japanese companies, followed by the large, medium, and then small companies. Just to orientate you to the format, we'll be talking in terms of performance over time, and then we'll be looking at benchmark versus world average, followed by the distribution of performance over the quarters. So for the Japanese top 100 organizations, you can see that 43% of the companies of the top 100 organizations have actually improved. That is fantastic. However, 47% of the companies have actually decreased in terms of the ratings. Only 10% have actually maintained the same. Inversely, when looking at the benchmark against your world peers, 70% of the top 100 companies are now doing not as well when compared to their peers. Only 24% are doing as well, right? 6% is maintaining the same. And observing the trend for the last 1 year, right, what you'll see is that at the beginning of Q1 of 2020, which is a 12-month window, we had 10 companies in the advanced stage. That has actually, bumped up a little bit, but now we're sitting at only 6 companies, 6 top 100 organizations at this level, still in the advanced stage, right? Now the good news is from 44 companies in the basic tier, which is a rating of 640 and below, that has reduced, right? Which means the companies have actually improved into this space, which is the intermediate range. So the intermediate range within the BitSight ratings is between 640 and 740. And you can see how the numbers have actually increased from 46 to 61. Right, so it's really good to see an averaging out of the Japanese top 100 organizations. Some of your top 5 companies probably sitting on the lower band of the advanced stage have dropped down to intermediate. But it's also good to see that many of your basic tiered companies have actually increased in their cybersecurity posture and reduced their cybersecurity risk. Just to give you a sense of what that distribution now looks like, is this. So many of you will be familiar with this slide that you've seen last year. Just to orientate those who are not familiar with this slide, essentially what you're looking at is, of course, the median line here. And any company that is in the below that line is below average. Companies that are above that line is above average, right? Followed by the median, right? And in this case is whether the company have decreased their ratings or increased their ratings. So you can see it's a pretty even spread. Almost 47% of the companies are below or reduced. Decreased in ratings. 43% of the companies have increased. You can see 24% are above average, whilst 70% have actually reduced. Now you can see a very tight cluster over here, right? And looking at the space, you can see actually the reduction is not significant in terms of ratings. It's probably a 50% drop at most, and that isn't too bad a behavior. There are some extreme outliers, of course, like this company here as well as this one. I won't be able to identify them out for you for this presentation, but we are looking at very significant rating increases, so that's pretty interesting too. Next, we'll look at all of the Japanese companies, which is another very interesting slide. So this is new, and you wouldn't have seen this last year. We are looking at a total of 11,132 Japanese companies. right? And based on the pre-pandemic versus the state today, it's unfortunate to see 69% drop in terms of ratings, 23% increase, 8% have maintained the same. But when you benchmark against the peers, for all of the companies, you can see 67% of the companies are actually better than the world average. Only 25% is slightly worse, and 8% of the companies are equal. So this is pretty okay. And in this case, whilst we are looking at the performance based on November versus the current, versus November of 2021 today versus January of 2020, which is pre-pandemic, you can see that there is an increase in the companies that are in the basic tier, right? And unfortunately, there's also a reduction in the number of companies that are doing as well. Right, so this is based on the observation of all of the Japanese companies, and we will take a look into how the companies fare based on their size. So next up, we have the large companies. We have 1,510 large companies, and what we mean with large companies is that they've got to have more than 2,000 employees. So based on the trend of pre-pandemic versus today, you can see 34% of these large companies have improved their ratings. Unfortunately, 57% of the companies have reduced. However, based on comparison against their world averages, you can see 53% of the companies fare better than their competitors or their peers. Now, 38% of the companies are doing as well. Now, the upside is there is a reduction in the companies in the basic tier from 313, right, in January of 2020. Today, we only have 218, and this is as of November 21. So almost 100 companies have actually moved into the intermediate space. However, similarly, I think based on what we've seen for the top 100 organizations, the number of advanced companies have also dropped from 387 to 216, which shows a consolidation of companies into the intermediate space here. So this is quite reflective of what we saw just now for the top 100 companies. Next, we'll look at the medium-sized companies, and there are 2,244 medium-sized companies, and what that means is companies with between 200 and 2,000 employees. So similarly, based on pre-pandemic versus today, you can see 25 companies have improvement in ratings. Unfortunately, a far greater number has reduced in ratings, 67%. The good news is when compared against their peers, you'll see that 67% of the companies are actually performing better than the world average. Only 26% is performing worse off. Now, what is also good to observe is, again, here where back in January, we have 118 companies in the basic tier. There's a slight increase of about 11 companies. And, unfortunately, a far more number of companies moving from advanced stage to from 692 dropping number down to 380, right? So a lot more of them have moved into the intermediate space here again. This is fairly, I wouldn't say a very surprising trend. Companies, unfortunately, in this COVID situation, do need to cut costs. And unfortunately, that cost may have come at the investment of towards cybersecurity. The other way of looking at it is because of the need to adapt to COVID. Companies have actually increased their cybersecurity footprint tremendously, right? Imagine trying to establish omni-channel strategies that includes mobile applications, internet websites, establishing your presence on Amazon, right? Online shopping platforms and so on. That would definitely increase your attack surface. And if cybersecurity spending is not increased to mitigate those exposures, then you will observe this kinds of increase in risk and reduction in ratings. So that's for the medium companies. And the last slide here, it's for the companies conversation is really this. So from small companies, we have 7,378 companies, and small companies are companies with less than 200 employees, right, in the BitSight sense. You can see a significant number of companies have a reduction in terms of rating. That's 72%. Of course, the small companies are the ones feeling the tightest squeeze. And in terms of performance against their peers worldwide, you can see 76% of the small companies are performing much more better than their world average. And this is very impressive statistic to look at. So for January of 20 versus July of 21, you can see, in fact, the number of companies in the basic tier have not increased significantly. There's only 2 increase. The reduction is not very significant as well. You can see that there's only 46 companies who have moved into the intermediate space. So this is another fairly interesting observation. But by and large, you can observe across the 3 slides we've just shared, like for the large companies, a good majority of the Japanese companies, be it large, medium, as the number increases as well, right, 67% now, as well as small companies, you can see are doing really well in terms of performance when compared against your world average. So I think that's a very admirable performance indicator. And we have come to the end of today's presentation. Thank you all so much for your kind attention and also your time. I believe next we'll move on to the question and answer section of today's seminar. Now, if there are any questions, please feel free to bring it up and we'll have a good discussion out of it. So this has been Terence Cheong signing out for this presentation.